The boy hadn't spoken in 4 months. Not to the school counselor, who drove 40 minutes to sit in their living room with a notepad balanced on her knee. Not to his grandfather, who had flown in from Houston the week after the funeral and stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping on the pull-out couch and leaving cups of chamomile tea outside the boy's door every morning. Not to the pediatric therapist with the soft voice and the collection of fidget tools arranged on her coffee table like an offering. Not to anyone. His name was Tobias. He was 9 years old, and the world he had known, the one that included his mother, singing off-key to the radio on Sunday mornings, the one where someone checked the back of his neck for dirt before school and kissed him on the top of his head. That world had ended on a Tuesday in October, and no one had told him what was supposed to come next. His father, a man named Wendell Barnes, was 44 years old and the kind of man who had built 3 companies from nothing, who had learned early in life that any problem had a solution if you were willing to work long enough and hard enough to find it. He had worked that way after losing his mother. He had worked that way through 2 failed startups. He had worked that way through the worst years. The years before the money, when he and Tobias's mother, Renata, had eaten rice and canned beans for dinner twice a week and pretended not to notice. But there was no working his way through this. There was no iteration, no pivot, no version 2. Tobias sat at the breakfast table every morning and ate whatever was put in front of him, and then went back upstairs without being asked. And Wendell stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee going cold and felt, for the first time in his adult life, completely without direction. It was his sister Octavia who found Selah. Octavia lived in Atlanta and had opinions about everything, and she delivered most of those opinions by phone in a voice that suggested she had already considered your objections and found them unpersuasive. She called on a Wednesday evening while Wendell was standing in the backyard in the dark, not doing anything, just standing there with his hands in his pockets, because he couldn't think of a reason to go inside. "You need someone in that house who isn't grieving," she said. "You need someone whose whole life isn't shaped around that loss. Someone who can just show up and be ordinary." "I have a housekeeper," he said. "Mrs. Patterson is 67 years old and cried at Tobias's holiday concert last December. She's not going to help. So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you hire someone young enough to be useful, someone who's good with kids." She paused. "I know someone who knows someone. Her name is Selah Monroe. She's done this before, not grief counseling, nothing like that. She just has a way with children, particularly children who have shut down." Wendell said he would think about it. He called Octavia back the next morning. Selah Monroe arrived on a Friday in March, pulling up to the front of the house in a used silver Civic, with a crack in the passenger side mirror and a box of her things in the back seat. She was 38 years old. She had an easy way of moving, unhurried, and a face that was hard to read in a way that had nothing to do with coldness, more like deep water, still on the surface, everything happening below. She had grown up in Gary, Indiana, the youngest of 5 children, raised by a woman who cleaned offices overnight and a father who had loved them all deeply and died of a heart attack at 52, leaving behind a life insurance policy that covered exactly 1 month's rent. Selah had put herself through 2 years of community college, then transferred, then worked her way through a degree in early childhood development while working nights at a hotel front desk. She had married young, divorced amicably, and had no children of her own, not for lack of wanting, but because life had a way of arranging itself differently than you planned, and she had made a kind of peace with that, though the peace was not total, and she did not pretend it was. She rang the doorbell, and a man answered, who she did not initially realize was the owner of the house. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a small bleach stain near the hem and dark sweatpants, and he had the look of someone who had not slept a full night in longer than he could calculate. He was tall and broad-shouldered and very still, and he looked at her the way people look at things they are not sure they believe in yet. "Selah Monroe," she said. "Wendell," he said, "come in." He gave her a tour of the house, which was large and quiet and very clean in the way that houses become when no one is actually living in them comfortably. Everything in its place, nothing relaxed, no shoes left by the door, no magazines splayed open on the couch. She noticed these things. She noticed most things. Tobias is upstairs, Wendell said. He stopped at the bottom of the staircase. He knows you're coming. I told him we were going to have someone help out around the house for a while. He didn't respond. That's normal for him right now. How long has it been? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Since October. He looked at the stairs. She died in October. Selah nodded. She did not say she was sorry. She had learned a long time ago that those words, however well meant, had a way of closing things off rather than opening them, so she simply looked at the stairs with him for a moment, and then said, I'll go up and introduce myself. You don't have to. I know, she said. I'd like to. She went up alone. Tobias's room was at the end of the hall, the door half open. She knocked on the frame and leaned in without pushing the door all the way. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the bed, not doing anything. No phone, no book, no toy. Just sitting there in the quiet like a child who had run out of ideas about what to do with himself. He looked up at her. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth, though she didn't know that then. He had a small scar on his chin that she would later learn came from falling off a trampoline at his cousin's 7th birthday party, and he had recently grown about an inch without anyone noticing because there was no one in the house thinking about those things. Hey, she said. I'm Selah. I'm going to be around for a while. He looked at her. He did not speak. He did not look away either, which she took as a small thing, but noted it. That's fine, she said. You don't have to say anything. She looked around his room. There was a drawing on the desk, half finished, of what appeared to be a house with a large tree next to it. Did you draw that? She asked. He looked at the drawing, then back at her, a small nod. The tree's good, she said. The roots especially. She did not wait for a response. She said it was nice to meet him and went back downstairs. The first 2 weeks she did not try. That was the thing about Selah Monroe, that the people who hired her always misunderstood at first. They expected intervention. They expected techniques, activities, a plan. What she gave instead was presence. Steady, undemanding, slightly boring presence. And it turned out that was the thing that worked. She made breakfast in the mornings. She folded laundry. She fixed a cabinet hinge that had been loose since Wendell couldn't remember when. She was in the house the way good weather was in a house. You didn't think about it, but everything felt slightly better. Tobias came down for meals. He sat at the table and ate and looked at his plate and occasionally glanced up at her when she wasn't watching. She pretended not to notice the glances. She talked sometimes, not at him, just out loud, the way you might talk to yourself when you're cooking, about small things. The birds she'd seen at the feeder in the backyard. Whether the bread she was making was going to rise correctly. What the weather was supposed to be on Thursday. He never responded, but he stopped leaving the table so quickly. At the end of the second week, she was washing dishes when she heard a sound behind her. She didn't turn around. She heard the scrape of a chair being pulled out, and then silence, and she knew he had sat down at the kitchen table while she was working. She washed dishes. He sat. After about 10 minutes, she said without turning around, "There are oranges in the bowl if you want one." A long pause. Then the sound of the bowl being moved. She kept washing dishes and did not say anything else, and something in the room had shifted, and she knew it, and she let it settle without pressing on it. Wendell watched all of this from a distance that he told himself was respectful. He was in truth watching Selah more than he was watching Tobias. Not in the way that embarrassed him, or not only that, but in the way that someone watches another person do something they cannot understand, trying to locate the mechanism. He had hired 3 other people in the previous 4 months. A grief counselor who came on Tuesdays, a family therapist who came on Thursdays, a woman from the district who did home visits for children with prolonged trauma response. They were all qualified. They all had clipboards or tablets and careful professional warmth, and they all looked at Tobias like he was a problem they were ready to solve. Selah did not look at Tobias like anything except a person who was in the same room as her. On a Thursday evening in the third week, Wendell came into the kitchen to find Tobias sitting at the table watching Selah chop carrots. She was explaining, still out loud, still to no one in particular, why you cut carrots on a diagonal if you're putting them in soup. Because the surface area changes how they absorb the broth. Tobias said nothing, but his elbows were on the table, and his chin was resting in his hands, and his eyes were tracking the knife, and it was the most present Wendell had seen him since before October. He stood in the doorway too long. Selah glanced up, and their eyes met, and she didn't do anything, didn't smile, didn't signal. But there was something in her face, something that said, "Careful, don't move too fast." He went back to his office. He sat at his desk and did not work. After a while, he picked up his phone and opened the text thread with Octavia and typed, "She's good." Octavia replied immediately, "I know." The incident with a man named Drew Calloway happened in the fourth week. Drew was Wendell's director of operations, a man who had been with the company for 6 years and who had a habit of showing up unannounced at the house when he thought something needed Wendell's immediate attention. He was the kind of man who considered his own urgency to be self-evidently legitimate, and this had served him professionally in some ways and had cost him in others. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Wendell was on a call and let himself in through the side entrance, which Wendell had given him the code to for emergencies. He walked through the kitchen where Selah was working, looked at her the way men who are used to certain hierarchies look at women in domestic spaces, and said without preamble, "Where's Wendell?" "On a call," Selah said. "He shouldn't be long. I'll wait in the study." He put his briefcase on the kitchen counter.
"Can you bring coffee?"
It was not a question. Selah looked at the briefcase on her clean counter. She looked at Drew Calloway. She said, "The mugs are in the cabinet above the coffee maker. Help yourself." Drew Calloway went very still for a moment. Then he picked up his briefcase and went to the study. Tobias had been sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of juice. He had watched the whole thing. Selah went back to what she was doing. After a moment, she heard a sound from the direction of the table. She turned. Tobias was looking at her. His expression was something she hadn't seen on his face before. It might have been the beginning of something. Not a smile, not quite, but the architecture of one. She said, "You okay?" He looked down at his juice. A small, almost imperceptible nod, but he stayed at the table. He didn't leave. That was the longest he had ever stayed. The conversation happened on a Tuesday morning in the 5th week. It had rained the night before, and the backyard was damp and smelled of wet grass and dirt, and Selah had gone out early to check on the herb garden she had started in the raised beds along the fence. A project she had begun without asking permission, and without explaining herself, which Wendell had noticed and said nothing about. She heard the back door open behind her. She heard small footsteps on the wet patio stones. Then silence. Then, "What are you doing?" She kept her hands in the dirt. "Checking on the mint," she said. "It's been a little droopy." A pause. "Can mint die?" The voice was rusty, careful, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. "Sure," she said. "If it gets too dry or too waterlogged, it's actually harder to kill than most things, though. It tends to come back." A long silence. She heard him take a step closer. "My mom had plants," he said, "on the windowsill in the kitchen, little ones in pots." Selah did not turn around. She pressed the earth gently around the base of the mint and said, "What kind? I don't know." A pause. "Small ones. One had yellow flowers." "Might been marigolds," she said. "Or maybe a little succulent with a bloom. Did the flowers come in summer?" "I think so." His voice was thin but there. "I think they came in summer." She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of herbs. "Your dad let me start this. I'm hoping to get tomatoes going on the other side of the fence eventually. But I figured I should start small. I like tomatoes," he said. "Yeah? My mom used to put them in everything." A pause. "She said you couldn't trust a person who didn't like tomatoes." Selah turned slightly. Not all the way, just enough to look at him from the side. He was standing about 4 feet away in his socks, which were getting wet on the patio stones, and he was looking at the mint with an expression that was grief and remembering, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. She sounds like she had strong opinions, Selah said. Yeah. His voice was very quiet. She did. They stayed like that for a moment. Then he said, I'm Tobias. And Selah said, I know. I'm glad you told me. Wendell had seen it from the window. He had been in his home office with his coffee and a spreadsheet he wasn't reading, and he had looked up at the right moment and seen the two of them in the backyard. Selah crouched in the dirt, Tobias in his wet socks, standing close enough that they were clearly talking. He watched until Tobias went back inside, and then he sat very still at his desk for a long time. He didn't tell anyone what he had seen. He didn't mention it. He didn't text Octavia. He just held it somewhere inside himself. This small, impossible thing, this boy he couldn't reach, standing voluntarily next to someone he'd known for 5 weeks and talking. And the relief of it was so large he didn't know what to do with himself. He went downstairs an hour later and found Tobias eating a bowl of cereal at the kitchen table, reading a book. Actually reading, actually focused, and Selah at the counter slicing bread and not saying anything. Morning, Wendell said. Tobias looked up. He didn't speak, but he made eye contact, and that alone was something. That was the most something had been in a long time. In the weeks that followed, things opened slowly, the way things open after winter. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, and the increments mattered. Tobias started coming downstairs more. He started asking Selah questions about cooking, about the gardens, about wanted a second opinion on. He did not become the child he had been before October. That child lived in a different kind of time now. That child lived in a different kind of time now. But he became present in a way he hadn't been, and the house began to feel like a house again, lived in, something happening inside it. Selah noticed that Wendell was staying home more. He had been, by all accounts, the kind of man who was always in the office. 6 days a week before Renata died, 7 in the months after, as if the work could fill the space. But now she'd find him in the kitchen, in the late mornings, coffee in hand, ostensibly checking email, but actually just being there, present, in the way she had been present. He was watching her. She knew. She was not unaware of this. She was also not entirely objective about it. One evening he came into the kitchen while she was making soup and stood at the counter for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," she said. "Why the herbs?" "You didn't have to do that. That wasn't part of what we arranged." She stirred the pot. "I noticed the raised beds were empty. Seemed like a waste. You could have just left them." "I could have," she said. A pause. "Tobias talked about his mother today," he said. "He talked about her plants. He hasn't said her name to me since the fall. She didn't say anything." "What did you do?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation, it was genuine. "Nothing," she said. "I just made it possible for him to be comfortable enough to remember her without it being a crisis." She paused. "Kids do the rest themselves, usually." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, I have a meeting in Denver on Thursday. I've canceled it 3 times already." "You should go," she said. "I don't want to leave him. He'll be fine for 2 days." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "He's going to be fine, Wendell." It was the first time she had used his name. She hadn't planned it. It sat in the air between them for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "He asked me last night," Wendell said quietly, "if you were going to stay." She turned back to the soup. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was up to you." She said, "What do you want to tell him?" A long silence. The soup made a low, steady sound. "I want to tell him yes," he said. "If you'll let me." She didn't answer right away. She adjusted the heat on the burner. She thought about Gary, Indiana, and her mother working nights, and what it had taken to get from there to here, to this kitchen, to this quiet she had not expected and was not sure she deserved. She thought about Tobias in the backyard in his wet socks. She thought about the way Wendell stood at the window in the mornings, like he was looking for something, and wasn't sure it was still out there. "Ask me again when you get back from Denver," she said. He was quiet. She could feel him looking at her. Then, okay, he went to Denver. He came back in 2 days. In the meantime, Tobias helped Selah plant tomato seedlings along the fence. He got dirt on his jeans and did not care. And at some point, while he was pressing the small plants into the earth, he told her about the last trip he had taken with his mother to a state park in Tennessee, where they had hiked a trail that was supposed to be easy but wasn't. And his mother had complained the whole time and also refused to turn back because she said quitting was worse than being tired. Selah laughed. It came out of her before she could be careful about it. Just a real laugh, genuine and warm. Tobias looked at her, and then, quietly, he laughed too. It was a small sound, and it lasted only a moment, but it was there. It was real. That evening, she heard him on the phone with his grandfather in Houston, telling him about the tomatoes and the trail story, his voice uneven in places but there. Fully there. She stood in the hallway and did not move for a moment, and then she went back to the kitchen and sat down and felt something inside herself that she had been holding tightly for a long time begin, very slowly, to release. Wendell came back from Denver on a Saturday afternoon, driving himself from the airport, pulling into the driveway while Selah and Tobias were in the backyard. He stood at the back door for a moment before pushing it open. He was still in his travel clothes, carry-on at his feet. He looked out through the glass at the two of them. Tobias was telling Selah something. Something animated, hands moving, the whole story in his body, and Selah was listening with her whole face, the way she listened to everything. And Wendell thought, this is what I didn't know to look for. I was looking for someone to fix it. This is not fixing. This is just being. Just being alongside. He opened the door. Tobias, the tomatoes came up. Wendell said, yeah, Selah says they'll be ready in August probably. She says, we'll have too many. We can make sauce. Wendell said. Tobias considered this. Mom used to make sauce. She used to make everything, Wendell said. His voice was steady. She was a very good cook. Tobias nodded. Yeah. He looked at the seedlings. Yeah, she was. The three of them stood in the backyard for a moment, in the late afternoon light, and the silence was not empty. It was full. Full of the things that had been said, and the things that had happened, and the season changing in the garden. That night, after Tobias was in bed, Selah was in the kitchen putting away the dishes, and Wendell came in and stood by the counter. And she turned around. You said to ask you again when I got back, he said. I did, so I'm asking. He looked at her, not at the counter, not at the window. At her. I'm asking if you'll stay. She had thought about it in the days he was gone. She had thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything, looking at it from all sides, not just the sides she wanted to look at. There were practical things. There were professional things. There was the question of what it meant to have feelings for the man who employed you, and whether that was a thing you could navigate with any dignity, and what happened to Tobias if it went wrong. She had thought about all of that, and then she had thought about the way Tobias had laughed in the garden, and the mint that had drooped and come back, and the whole long distance between who she had been and who she was standing here being right now. And she thought about Wendell at the window in the early mornings, looking out, waiting for something to be true again. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He didn't move toward her. He stood there looking at her with something in his face that was careful and open at the same time. Okay, she started. I know, he said. We go slow. We go slow, she said. Tobias first, he agreed. She turned back to the dishes. He stayed in the kitchen. You want tea? She said. Yeah, he said. I do. She put the kettle on, and he pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, and the house settled around them in the way houses do when the people inside them are, for the first time in a long time, in the right place. The tomatoes came up in August, more than they could count. Tobias stood at the fence with his arms crossed, looking at them with an expression that was something between proud and overwhelmed, and he said, What do we do with all of these? We make sauce, Selah said. All of them? All of them. He was quiet for a moment, then, my mom's recipe is written down somewhere, in one of her notebooks. I think I know where it is. Selah looked at him. You want to find it? He thought about it. He looked at the tomatoes. Yeah, he said. I think so. Yeah. They went inside and they found the notebook, and hurried and absolutely certain of itself, the way Renata had been certain of most things. And Tobias sat at the kitchen table and read it out loud while Selah listened, and Wendell stood in the doorway and did not try to hide the fact that he was crying. Because some things are too real to be private, and grief and relief can feel, sometimes, like almost the same thing. They made the sauce. It took all afternoon, and the kitchen smelled the way it used to smell. And the boy talked the whole time, and the house was loud with something it hadn't been loud with in over a year, and outside, the last of the summer held on in the garden, patient and full. Every plant they had put into the ground now given back.